Hello, everyone. This is Leah Pogariller. Let's go around the room and say who else is here at HCBS.
Hi, this is Lori Thompson.
This is Dennis Roy with HCBS.
Kira Kuno with HCBS. Do we have our CDPHE folks on the line?
Good morning. This is Kara Johnson-Hufford at CDPHE. Can you hear us, Leah?
Yes.
And then we, of course, also have
Barbara Idell.
And I'm going to mute the beeps. Hang on. Okay, if we did this right, everyone should be able to hear the folks at CDPHE and HCBS. And I was just getting to Nancy Harris at CDHS. Is she on the line? Oh, you know what? She doesn't have the moderator. Could you email her the moderator code so she could drop out and dial back in?
Or Nancy, if you're on the line right now, don't forget you have to unmute yourself.
Yes.
By dialing star...
Star 1 or star 6. You may be able to unmute yourself that way. Sorry to force mute everyone. It was getting a little hectic. Okay.
Leah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm on.
Great, thanks. So that's Nancy. And this is the HCBS Settings Rule Implementation Team. And we want to thank you all for joining us. And also thank you all for sending such good questions. Because of the volume of questions that we received, we are going to dive right in with just a few introductory notes. One is thanks for submitting questions. If you have a question, very often someone else has already submitted the same question, so it's really helpful for us to see what questions are out there and be able to fill in the gaps for all of you. I will add that this call is being recorded, and if everything is functioning the way we think it is, there is also a transcript being generated. And we will put that online after the call for folks who couldn't join us or didn't find this call accessible. We also do intend down the road to put what we're saying here in writing and get formal clearance. So please understand that because questions were trickling in up until yesterday, all of what we're saying is answers that the settings rule team and the folks you're going to hear from today on the phone. This is all what we think makes sense, but none of this has been formally cleared and would have to be before we can put it in writing and make it official. So with that, we are just going to start going through all your questions. We are trying to make it easy for you all to take notes and find the material we're referring to. So this will proceed in order of the headings that are in the written FAQ. If we thought your question referred to one item but really made sense somewhere else, it may not be in the order you're expecting it. So just please bear with us. Okay, the first question relates to requirements for all HCBS settings, and the question is pretty broad. It's, does the settings final rule apply to the CHIRP program? And the answer is yes. A lot of our materials have cited CHIRP as an affected program. It's referred to in that first FAQ. And in general, participants in the CHIRP program have the same rights as everyone else. If you think that a person in the program should have a rights modification because of their individual circumstances, you should follow the process in FAQ item number 29. And we do think it's fair to acknowledge that the younger the person is, the more rights modifications may be warranted, and the more streamlined you can probably be in explaining why you want the rights modification and what you will do to revisit it. As the person gets older, you would need more robust reasons for any modifications and a more robust process for revisiting them and helping the individual not need those modifications. There is one difference we need to flag, which is that if the CHIRP participant is under 18, they can't legally sign a lease. And we haven't yet issued our guidance on leases as a whole, so please just stay tuned for that. I want to pause and invite Nancy to unmute herself, which is, again, star 6, whatever you did before, if you want to add anything about CHIRP.
Okay, sorry, Lee, I had to turn it off again. No, you worded that very appropriately. I just want to make sure that anyone that's listening in regarding SHRP needs to remember that that really does need to be documented clearly in the service plan for that individual.
Great, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we'll move on to the header called Community Integration and Individual Autonomy. The first question here was, if the PASA, meaning a provider in the DD world, if the PASA is an individual's rep payee and they're involved in many budgeting decisions, they may need to restrict spending behavior because the person lacks funds. So what due process does the state see needing to be implemented on top of the rep payee role? So there are a few things for you to look at. First, before you're becoming a rep payee or really taking on any role with someone's finances, you should take a look at FAQ number 35, where we talk about money management policies and how you have to acknowledge that the individual may be able to do these activities independently. So if you think that they can't, then there is an assessment of their skills, and the person-centered plan documents what kind of assistance they need and what support you're providing to help them to become more independent over time. And that's whether or not you're going to be a rep payee. If the provider is going to be a rep payee, then there's additional guidance in FAQ number 7. And there we explain that you do need to document in the person-centered plan the agreement about how you're going to handle funds, and a reference that the Social Security rep payee rules apply, if they do, to your situation. So when you say that you're going to follow the Social Security rules, you're stating that you will be able to restrict spending or whatever it is the rules say you have to do or can do. I don't know those rules, but if you're acting as the rep payee, those are the rules that you and your individual are agreeing to. And you do need to make sure that the individual understands what the policy means and how it will affect them. Barb has a special comment to add here.
Yeah, I just want to mention, along with what Leigh already covered, the things that we also look for in the policy, procedure, or practice is to make sure that even as a rep payee, you understand that some individuals may need full assistance, of course, but others don't necessarily. And we'll also look to be sure that regardless of ability, if there's this broad statement in a policy or procedure that in order for someone to access or make decisions about spending money, that they have to go through a department that they're only available during work days between 8 and 5, non-holidays, those kinds of things, in a sense, broadly restrict individual rights, even with the designated rep payee. So you want to make sure you have some way for folks to make decisions about spending their money as they're able to at any time. Thanks.
Great. Okay, if you're moving through the written FAQ, the next heading is security, and we did not receive questions on that. So we're going to move right to the heading called privacy, dignity, respect, and freedom from coercion and restraint. We had a question whether internal monitoring devices such as audio monitors and chimes require informed consent. And the answer is yes. If you'll take a look at FAQ number 12, we talk about how if an individualized assessment indicates that a person needs support in moving within the setting and an internal device would be helpful for them, the modification should be reflected in their person-centered plan. So that is a rights modification, and you can look at item number 29 to see how the process goes for doing rights modifications, and it includes informed consent. We also wanted to flag that exterior door chimes and other egress alert devices are handled very similarly and must be documented in the individual's person-centered plan as a rights modification, which again means getting informed consent. That's in item number 8. And Barb also wanted to add a point here, and I'll invite her to chime in.
Yeah, just to make sure that with any rights modifications that there's mitigation done, and that what we do is we make sure, for instance, if the person's not going to be there on vacation, that chime should not be on. And what we see probably most often is chimes will sometimes be used only to alert staff at night that someone needs help because they're getting out of their bedroom. So therefore, that chime should not be on constantly, should only be activated at night.
Okay. We had a question about cameras in public areas of group homes. The questioner would like to know the basis for the determination that there's a violation of privacy when using these, given that CCTV has become quite common in public areas of society and is probably in use at DHS and HCBS. The response to this is that we aren't aware of anything that qualifies as a public area of a group home. There are common areas in group homes, like living rooms, kitchens, dining rooms, and so on, but those are not public areas. They're parts of the resident's private home. Many of us live with families or roommates where we share areas, but we don't accept cameras on us at all time when we're in our own living area with them or alone. So our basis for making this determination is the settings rule, which says that everyone has rights to privacy, dignity, and respect, especially in the place they live. And CMS has also issued guidance that at least flags concerns with cameras, and we share those concerns. So any setting that has cameras in these areas without appropriate individualized rights modifications in place has a significant compliance issue, and that needs to be remedied right away. This is a good example of a kind of fix that can and should happen now, not years from now. We have talked about the fact that we're still trying to collect cost information through the web-based provider transition plan, which is having technical issues, and we're still developing it, and it hasn't been rolled out yet. But if you can do something that is not as expensive as hiring a new staff person or buying a new vehicle, this is the kind of thing that you should do as soon as you identify the issue. Okay, population served, we didn't have questions on, so we're going to move to additional requirements for residential settings. So there was a question here about leases that require renters to meet current law and enforce quiet hours in multifamily complexes. Are lease provisions such as these that apply to typical individuals with and without IDD in alignment with the rule? So in our response to item number 34 in the FAQ, we talked about house rules that prohibit bringing sex workers into the home to engage in sex for pay. And we said that we don't object to rules like that, even though they limit the resident's ability to have visitors, because they prohibit conduct that is illegal for everyone under Colorado law. So under similar reasoning, we wanted to say that a rule that prohibits other kinds of unlawful behavior in the same way as another typical lease is okay. Quiet hours are a little different because they can affect lawful conduct in a way that's overbroad. And here we wanted to draw your attention to item number 35, where we listed some problems that CDPHE has seen in all their site visits and reviewing provider documents. And they cited house rules and leases and other documents that limit rights through really broad-based requirements that there's a curfew or mandatory hours where you're in your room. And what CDPHE suggests is that if you're having problems with people being loud at night, you can try individualized approaches to solving that problem, potentially including an individualized rights modification. Barb, I want to pause here.
Sure. Just to reiterate that for our part, when we're out and we are able to talk with places about, when you have multiple residents living in any home, that for the most part, places are able to work through how they're being respectful to one another. What we look for really is exactly what was discussed, in that we will see places where people are told all your TVs and radios must be off by 10. Everybody has to be in the room by 10 at night and can't be back up at 6 o'clock in the morning. And we just make sure that facilities understand, providers understand that if they really do have someone causing a disruption, they can address that individually. Thanks.
Okay, we are moving on to the big header called Additional Requirements Relevant to All Settings. And the first subheader there is Additional Requirements in General. We got a few questions here that we wanted to go into. The first here is that In the FAQ, we mentioned that CMS told us during a call that individuals receiving HCBS should experience day settings with the same degree of access as individuals not receiving HCBS to exercise personal choice regarding when to eat, when to visit with others, and so on. The questioner wants to know that since most workplaces have standards of conduct that do limit personal choice about when you eat and visit with others and so on, how should providers comply with the rule while also helping people learn the skills they need to move into an integrated workplace? So the answer here is in a few parts. If the provider is supporting an individual in a workplace setting that is not provider-owned or controlled, then the usual rules of the workplace apply. So here we're talking about individual-supported employment at Target or in an office, group-supported employment, doing janitorial work at an office. In these kinds of settings, employees usually can't eat when they want, can't take phone calls and texts all the time, and the same goes for supported individuals. So that said, supported employment groups can include people without disabilities, and if you as a provider extend those people courtesies like being able to take an occasional personal phone call or having a soda while they work, then you do need to extend those same freedoms to people with disabilities. The second part of the answer is if the provider is supporting an individual in a workplace or pre-voc setting that is provider-owned or controlled. Here the default is that individuals are not limited in their ability to eat, drink, text, and so on. And if that becomes a problem in an individual case, then the provider should work with the individual to help them learn the skills and techniques that they need to handle these freedoms in a socially acceptable way. If that doesn't work, then you can follow the procedure for modifying rights on an individualized basis. We had a follow-up question on this front, which is, what if the setting is provider-owned or controlled, but it's supposed to be like a typical workplace? So we're talking about coffee bars, restaurants. It's patronized by members of the public. In that case, then the provider can institute general rules about eating, drinking, texting, and so on, so long as those rules would be found in a typical workplace of that kind and apply equally to staff with and without disabilities. We had another question. How does the department instruct providers to ensure they're meeting this requirement about the quote-unquote same degree of access as individuals not receiving HCBS, while simultaneously working to meet the standards that supported community connection activities use the community as a learning environment, because many community settings have standards of conduct that they do expect everyone to follow. And many volunteer activities also have strict expectations. So on this, we wanted to point to our answer to item number 21, where we said that non-residential settings that are not provider-owned or controlled should comply with the additional criteria like access to food and visitors to the same extent as they do for other individuals. So what that means is that participants have the same rights and freedoms and the same obligation and expectation as everyone else out there in the community. If the museum doesn't let people eat near the exhibits, then your supported community connection participants can't either. If the library doesn't allow people to have phone conversations in the reading room, then your participants can't either. And the same expectation of consistent, standards of conduct would apply in volunteer activities too. Okay, we had a number of questions about access to food, which is the next header here. The first question is, what is the expectation of a provider to demonstrate that special diets are followed while also ensuring ready access to food, snacks, and alternate meals? The expectations for residential providers are in FAQ item number 22, and for non-residential providers in item number 23. We wanted to add that when you're considering special diets, you should also take a look at item 24, where we say that access to food can be restricted, but only on an individualized basis as set forth in item 29. We also say that if a person has a rights modification in place that restricts their access to food at any time, then other people that aren't subject to that modification still need a way to access food at any time. So if the fridge is locked for one person, then other people need a key to the lock or a code or some other method, which we will dive into in a second here. And Barb, I think you had a note here.
Right. We just want to make sure that we don't always automatically restrict access for individuals who do have a recommended food or diet issue. If you think about ourselves, who don't necessarily have an IDD or other disabilities, but we may have diabetes or we're supposed to lose weight, we all have access to food, and we make decisions that are not always perfect. So as we work through that with individuals, I think we need to keep in mind that we don't automatically restrict just because some doctor has recommended a particular food dietary restriction of sorts. Thanks.
Okay, so we had a question here which relates to a woman who has Prader-Willi syndrome. I think probably all the IDD folks on the phone know what this is, but since we have all kinds of folks on the phone, Prader-Willi is a genetic condition that can make it so that people don't have like a sensation of fullness and just would compulsively eat to the point where it's a risk to their health and safety. So the question here is a woman has Prader-Willi syndrome, and she moved into a host home. And they want to know, the gist of this question is sort of what do we do with her, and what do we do if a second person moves into the host home who doesn't have Prader-Willi. So this provider should work with the individual with Prader-Willi and her case manager to implement a rights modification as described in item number 29. And this process is in addition to the current process for implementing a rights suspension or restrictive procedure. So if and when another person is getting ready to move into that host home, and we're talking about another person in receiving services, the provider needs to work with the new person to avoid having to modify their rights at all, even informally. So for example, the second person could get a key or a key code to access a locked fridge and pantry. We had a suggestion from Shiloh Carson. Perhaps if the individual wants a mini fridge or a locked cabinet in their own bedroom, that could be an option. Unless this new person also has Prader-Willi syndrome, you're going to work with them to avoid any kind of rights modification, formal or informal. They should just get access to food, and there's ways you can do that with technology or with the right kind of fridge. Now, we had a related question, a follow-up to that first question, which is, could we walk through the different options available for that second individual? And in the question, the questioner suggested a private fridge and cabinet for the second individual, and that's a great idea. Those could be in the second person's bedroom, to which they have their own lock. It could be in the host home kitchen with some kind of lock that some people can open and some people can't. So there are some other options in the written answer to item number 22, footnote 26. You could consider a separate kitchenette. That may make more sense for a larger setting and not necessarily a host home, but who knows, if you have a big enough host home, you could have just a separate kitchenette. And if providers have other creative methods to address this, we would love to hear from you and be able to share them with others. So for the person with Prader-Willi syndrome who has the rights modification, the case manager should document that in their person-centered plan and share the relevant portions with the provider. For the second individual, there is no rights modification if you're providing the private fridge and cabinet or some other solution. So there is no need for special documentation in that person's person-centered plan that they create with their case manager. The provider-created ISSP, Individual Service and Support Plan. Thank you, Lori. The provider-created ISSP for that second person should reflect that there's some kind of special arrangement. But that's all you would need to do. Okay, we're going to move on to private communications and accessibility. So there was a question that in a host home environment, it can be challenging to make all the appliances accessible. And if the person wants to continue to live in that home that doesn't have some accessibility features like front-loading washers, is that allowable? The answer is that, assuming that the home complies with all the other existing legal requirements like ADA and safety codes, then yes, this is allowable. This is the kind of situation that we had in mind at the end of our answer to item 26, where we were saying if immediate achievement of these standards or prompt achievement as new client needs arise would entail significant capital expense, e.g. buying new laundry appliances, providers can wait to incur the expense until that part of the setting is rebuilt, remodeled, or replaced. Barb, I have a note here.
Sure. I think that you can take to a certain degree the individual's level of functioning into consideration. So if you have someone who's very severe, profound, and could not possibly help with laundry, but we really do have some people with accessibility issues who would probably appreciate the opportunity to start to learn to help in the kitchen or to do laundry. So anything that we can do to help address these barriers to be respectful of them and work with them on their independence would be great. I would also mention we do still on occasion find settings that simply are not physically accessible, just even ramp and stair-wise. So be sure when you're setting up homes and have people and services that they are able to maneuver just even around all common areas in their own bathrooms and bedroom areas. Make sure those are physically accessible.
Okay. Then there was a question, how do the physical requirements of homes, as required by the final settings rule, apply to host homes and the requirement of new sites needing to meet the full standard? And there's a concern about limiting accessible housing. So what we said in our answer to number 26 is that delayed compliance due to cost concerns isn't allowed for new settings. And that position was really driven by the CMS requirement, to which we're all subject, that new settings are supposed to comply with the settings rule from the outset. The transition period is really only intended for settings that were in operation when the rule came out. So how are we going to apply this concept to host homes? We wanted to refer you to a communication brief that we issued on this in November. You can get that on the settings rule website. We have all of our guidance listed on our website. There is also an Office of Community Living website where you'll also be able to see that communication brief. And we talk about what to do with a new setting and how you should handle that. The gist of what we said there is that our main concerns are really new providers, like a whole new entity coming on board here, and the situation where an existing provider adds a whole new service type. If you're a provider and you've been providing host home services for years and you want to just work with some new host home providers, that's not something we're planning to track or assess in the provider transition plan system that we're developing. That's a transition plan system for entities that are covered by the transition period. But we do want to keep in mind that none of us, especially us, we are not going to have enforcement flexibility after that transition period ends. Okay, let's move on to intersection of settings criteria with person-centered planning. The first header was individual choice. I think maybe we didn't get questions on that, so we'll move to rights modification. Lori, can I put you on the spot so I can drink some water?
So which one?
28, yeah.
Okay. So historically, unsupervised time has been dealt with like a restricted procedure when an individual cannot demonstrate the necessary skills to keep themselves or the community safe. What guidance does the department offer the individuals who are unsafe to self or others in the community? We fully understand the dignity of risk, but currently support individuals who have recent histories of violent and/or drug crimes. What is our responsibility as an HCBS DD provider to keep individuals out of jail or the community safe? So our response to this is if people pose a danger to themselves or others in the community, then a court may have already imposed some restrictions on them. And so the agency, the service provider, needs to follow those restrictions and make sure that they're documented in the person-centered plan. Without a court order, so absent a court order, if you think some kind of limitation is necessary, then the agency needs to follow the procedure in item number 29 for implementing rights modifications.
Okay, the next one says that the DD waiver places responsibility for health, safety, and welfare of individuals with the provider. How does the withdrawal of notice for the continuation of protections, I think this question is asking what happens if the individual withdraws their informed consent to things that keep them safe. What if the person engages in behaviors that could land them in jail or engage in self-injurious behaviors to the extent that they would need hospitalization? We're very concerned about the risk to the person and the community and the liability to the provider. So in response to this, we want to refer to item number 32, which talks about what happens if the individual refuses consent or withdraws consent to some kind of modification that the provider believes is necessary. So if the modification is really necessary and the individual or their guardian won't grant consent, then the provider can decide that it can no longer offer services and give notice to this individual with time allowed for the person to provide a new provider. That's all pretty much an existing rule. While you're waiting for your new provider to be arranged for this person, you may be able to take actions not because you have consent, but justified even without consent because you're engaging in self-defense or defense of others. And we will get into that concept in a little more detail in a bit. There was a question about how difficult it is to amend a service plan via the bridge. Does the department plan on looking at the system to make it more compatible with amendments? The answer is yes. So this comes from Brittany Trujillo. The department is continuously looking at the bridge for improvements as we come into compliance with the CMS rule. And some of this will be addressed in the new support plan that's in development based off the new assessment process. Okay, there was a question about what to do with informed consent and court orders or lack thereof when you have a person in zombie therapy. I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
Yeah. Some people say SOMB.
SOMB. And what we're talking about here, for people who don't know this acronym, it is Sex Offender Management Board, SOMB, therapy. And how do you protect people in the community when you also have to get the individual and services permission to limit their access to the community. So we really wanted to make sure that we are on the same page here and giving you consistent guidance. So Lori and I, or Kira and I, perhaps all of us?
All three of us.
All three of us had a call with a representative of the Colorado Division of Criminal Justice Office of Domestic Violence and Sex Offender Management. So that's a mouthful, but that's the board that, or that's the office that would be involved in the subject of this question. And we do have a representative of that office on the line right now, and we'll invite her to chime in to using whatever key code it was to unmute herself if she would like to chime in. But here's what we discussed. As we just said in answering a few prior questions, if people pose a danger to others, a court may already have imposed some restriction, and you do need to follow those restrictions and make sure they're documented in the person-centered service plan. I want to pause here and just say, throughout this call, just like in the FAQ, when we're talking about the person-centered service plan, we are talking about the plan that the person develops with their case manager, whatever that plan may be called.
So that historically for the IDD system, that's been called, long ago it was the individualized plan, the IP, and then now it's technically in the bridge, it's called the service plan. And then for other service systems, for other populations, it's sometimes called a care plan. So.
Yeah. Okay, so I think it sounds like the greater concern is what do you happen when the person doesn't have a court order, but you think some kind of limitation is necessary. And so this is really relevant if you're working with someone who may have had their criminal case dismissed on competency grounds, was never convicted, and isn't under a court order to participate in therapy, to not look at pornography, to not spend unescorted time in the community, and so on. So what you should do is follow the procedure in item number 29 for implementing rights modifications. You don't sit on your hands and say there's, oh, well, nothing we can do. You identify the kinds of rights modifications that you think are necessary, and you work with that individual and their case manager to document and implement the restrictions. Now, we have also heard the concern that some individuals won't consent to rights modifications that the provider thinks are necessary. And you may have to tell that person, if you don't consent to these restrictions or modifications, then we cannot serve you safely and you will have to find a different provider. And that is, I think we all acknowledge, that is not a great situation. But it is also not very different from what has existed up until now. Individuals, if you wanted to impose a rights suspension on them and they didn't want it, they could always just walk away from you as a provider, maybe to another provider and maybe not. So we have great respect for you all as providers and expect that you probably have some good techniques for handling that kind of situation, and you probably want to draw on those kinds of techniques going forward. Okay, the next question, when an individual is on probation or parole and the court doesn't provide specifics, so they may say no contact with a minor, but they don't specify exactly how much supervision. This provider would typically implement line-of-sight supervision as a suspension of rights. How does the department see being able to do this and ensure protection for the community? The answer is pretty much what we just said in the prior question. If there's not a court order, follow the procedure in item number 29, which means you're getting informed consent and documenting a lot of other details. This is a new question, will the department be creating a consent form that complies with the federal standards? The answer is we, as the team on this call implementing the settings rule, have not been planning to create such a form.
But one would assume that the consent, for the most part, that y'all have been using for other things, at least in the IDD community, again, for restrictive procedure, for example, you need to have an informed consent for that behavioral ISSP, and you need to have informed consent anytime you use psychotropic medication, again, in the IDD system. So I would at least take that as a beginning point, a starting point to develop your agency's, your provider's own informed consent.
Thank you. That's great. Yeah. Okay. Then we had a question. Enforcement of providers complaining with the rule settings and completing documentation and following all the recommendations from a Human Rights Committee can be a concern. We understand that CDPHE is the oversight agency for compliance with the rule settings. Will CDPHE also be the oversight agency for noncompliance of consent forms? The questioner who asked this question, I have to tell you, we didn't quite understand the first part about what the concern is with enforcement. So please let us know if this following piece doesn't answer your question. The HCBS settings final rule prescribes a detailed process for modifying rights, and informed consent is one part of this process. Case management agencies are involved in the entire rights modification process, specifically collecting all that information and making sure it's all there. CDPHE is going to continue to be HCBS's partner in ensuring that provider agencies and case management agencies comply with the full federal settings rule. I guess that's what we think the question is getting at, and if that isn't what you were trying to understand, please submit a new form of that question. The provider, I guess we should clarify, the provider who thinks the rights modification is necessary should be involved in the front line of, collecting the information and explaining what did and didn't work and getting the informed consent. But it's all centralized and stored with the case manager. Okay, we had a question. What is the expectation on the provider to ensure health and safety when the individual revokes consent for support around managing critical health needs like brittle diabetes? Can the department provide clarification about when consent is revoked and the individual's immediate health and safety could be in danger? Oh, this question also wants to know about pica, where people eat non-food items. And so the answer here is to refer to our item number 32, where we say that if the requisite consent is not provided or is withdrawn, then again, you as a provider may decide that you can no longer safely serve this individual and give them notice to find a new provider. After the consent is withdrawn, you can't take actions that were legal only because you had that consent. But you can still take actions that are legally justified on some ground other than consent, such as self-defense or defense of others. So if someone is about to eat something that's going to send them to the hospital, then intervention to prevent them from seriously harming themselves may very well be warranted as defense of others here. And if you do that, then you need to refer to the rules for restraints and emergency control procedures because it may be something that you have to report if you do it. A related question here is what risk affecting a person's health and safety is an allowable risk? How do providers know when we are appropriately following the recommendation to allow for some dignity of risk versus our obligation to provide for the individual's health and safety? So the answer here is if there is an existing health or safety standard in any source of law, then you as a provider have to follow it. So just for an example, ACFs have to follow HCBS regulations for ACFs, as well as CDPHE's regulations for ALRs, which include requirements relating to health and safety. If there's not a statute or regulation on the subject, the settings rule helps you fill in the gap by having a process led by the individual in which the individual decides what kind of risk they want to take and what restrictions they'll accept. So as a provider, your role is to help the individual understand the risk and make informed choices, and to help them learn skills so that over time they can make better choices and need fewer restrictions. And if you think a rights modification is necessary and the individual doesn't, go back and look at item number 32, which again helps you see what to do in that case.
Leah?
Yes.
This is Nancy. I'm going to have to break off to go to another meeting, but thank you for presenting all this great information.
Thanks for joining us, Nancy.
Bye-bye.
Okay, we're about to transition to a subject that we did get a number of questions about, and this is about the timeline in the FAQ to obtain an informed consent and eliminate rights modifications by May 31st, 2018. We heard from several providers and case management agencies that this isn't enough time to do all the work that needs to be done, find all the information, get all the documentation. And so people are worried that that is too much of a time crunch. So I think the short answer here is that the deadline made sense to us and was vetted at the time, but we hear you. We hear you. And so we want to be realistic, and we want you all to have time to do things the right way. So based on this input that we got from all of you and further consultation within CDPHE and HCPF, here is our plan. The plan is to revise the deadline to take advantage of existing individualized service planning cycles. So everyone has to have at least one big annual cycle where they're updating their service plan and they're getting updated information. And again, this is talking about the person-centered plan that they're creating with the case manager for their whole system of supports and services. So you all should take advantage of that annual cycle to get all the updated documentation and consents into place by next May. So we're looking at May 31st, 2019. We acknowledge and understand that person-centered plans can take effect up to 90 days after you get them documented. So that means that by August 31st, 2019, the updated rights modification goes into effect or is eliminated depending on what you all were able to agree to and document with each individual. I do want to flag that because of this, like the reality of the way that case planning works, and because we're still doing ongoing development with OIT on the web-based platform for provider transition plans, what this means is that we're probably looking at extending the statewide compliance deadline by a year to March 2021. That is something that we still have to talk with CMS about and get approval for. So that is not final, but it's what we as the settings rule team thinks makes sense. So that is what we are going to put forward. So we will have to issue something in writing. This is the first time I think that we've discussed it outside of the state agencies here. And before it goes into writing, I think we will have to get more official conversation with CMS, hopefully quite soon. So I think you cannot count on this as the absolute final date, but you can count on it as what we are advocating and think makes sense based on the situation. There is one flag or caveat here, which is that this extension doesn't mean that providers can defer compliance or coming into compliance until 2021. It means that by March 2021, everything is supposed to be wrapped up, including time for us to make final compliance determinations and help individuals at non-compliance settings transition to other settings or funding sources, and that will take some time. So as you as a provider fill out your provider transition plan and identify compliance issues, which you may already have done with CDPHE, you need to be taking whatever remedial actions are identified now, unless there's a real barrier to doing so, like a statutory barrier or a major compliance cost. We had a few questions, I think, that are very similar to that, so let me just make sure we answered all of them. There was a question, is the May 31st deadline related only to the assessment of rights modifications or the entire PTP, provider transition plan? The answer is, yeah, that May 31st deadline only relates to rights modifications. There are other steps that providers can be taking right now or as soon as they complete their PTP to ensure overall compliance with the rule. There was a question, will rules be altered prior to May 31st? Is there a process to get an extension? When are we going to amend regulations to include this work? So because of the extension I just described, that's an extra year, and that new deadline is pretty far off. We are not currently considering additional extensions on top of that. As for the rules and regs, some of you have heard us say this a few times. We don't want to rush the regs. We don't want to impose a potentially unfunded mandate on providers or others. So if you can be taking reasonable steps to come into compliance now, you should. In your PTP, when that web-based system rolls out, you'll have a way to let us know if you're facing significant compliance costs, if you're going to have to hire people or anything, based on the rule as you understand it under the last FAQ. And once we have that information, we will know whether and how to kind of go about finalizing rules, and whether there needs to be a budget action, which we just don't have the information to decide right now. Okay. What will be the process for emergency right suspensions, restrictive procedures, and emergency control procedures? Not having an outlet for these will severely restrict a provider's ability to serve many individuals. The answer here is that under our current regs, emergency rights suspensions are used when imminently necessary to protect the health and safety of the person, others, or property. This is a DD rule. I think we should clarify this is for the DD world, IDD world. And emergency control procedures are used in order to keep the person receiving services and others safe. So these measures usually involve self-defense or defense of others, and that means you can use them even when the individual does not consent. If you're using an emergency right suspension just to protect property, then you don't have self-defense or defense of others, and we would have to check on whether defense of property is a legal basis to do something. But we don't read the rule, the federal rule, as preventing the appropriate use of these procedures so long as you follow the procedures in the regs, the current regs. On restrictive procedures, there's no emergency restrictive procedures, so you would just follow the same process as usual for getting a regular restrictive procedure, which includes getting informed consent and other items required for your behavioral individual service and support plan, BISSP.
Again, that's in the IDD system.
Yeah. And then get whatever additional documentation you need under items 29 and 31 in that FAQ. Okay, we had a question about how we said in the FAQ that we aren't planning to change procedures right now relating to the Human Rights Committees, which is, again, an IDD world entity, except that we said that wherever notice has historically been required, the notice now is just a prelude to informed consent, and you should keep them both on file. Does this mean that suspensions may still occur short-term in emergency situations while teams confer and work to achieve consent? Yes, that's and that's related to the answer we just gave to the prior question. A question, does the department expect that we continue to follow all due process and suspension of rights and restrictive procedures in addition to the new due process outlined here? And a related question, what does the right to due process look like for the individual? Yes, that's what we expect. All the existing due process still applies, and on top of that, the settings final rule applies. So if you were already following due process rules, which is mainly in the waivers serving people with IDD, continue to follow those procedures and also get informed consent and whatever other documentation you may be required under item 29. And keep in mind, though, that there is a pretty fair amount of overlap between what we have already been requiring in the IDD world and the newer requirements. So it's not always a ton more information. Does the department anticipate that the due process for restrictive procedures and suspension of rights will be the same moving forward? And if they're the same, what separates these two modifications? The answer is that the more we learn about the federal rule, the more we are starting to think that there should be a single streamlined process for everything, whether it's what we used to call a restrictive procedure, a right suspension, or any other kind of modification to someone's rights. So we are studying this issue, and we may end up having to update the crosswalk where we set out what our roadmap is for kind of making bigger regulatory changes to make everything consistent and simple. So yes, we are starting to think that there's too many similar terms out there for similar things, and there probably ought to be a more streamlined process. The exact details of that have not been decided, and we do think, at least for the foreseeable future, though, that human rights committees will continue to play their current role, which is some kind of involvement and oversight to make sure that people that any kind of restriction makes sense for the individual. What is the expected timeline for the bus to be ready for input of our documentation? You can start inputting, I think this question is inputting documentation relating to the rights modification, and you can start doing that now. Just use the log notes field, which we mentioned in item number 31. You can check, reading my script wrong. We will check on the timing of the development of dedicated fields for rights modifications. I think we just got this question at the last minute, so we still have to check on the timing of when there will be dedicated fields. But if you're ready to roll now, just use the log notes field. There's a question here about without the ability to limit certain rights when someone removes consent, for example, limiting access to sharps, chemicals, fire-starting materials, and so on, it could become dangerous to serve individuals. The department says that we may choose to terminate an individual in that case, but we must allow time for the person to find a new provider. How do we help the person and the provider stay safe in the time that it's taking the person to find a new provider without being able to limit access to the dangerous items? So we had a question for this provider, which is, how are you currently handling this situation if there's not already a rights suspension in place? So we wanted to know, and I think if the provider is on the line, you can unmute yourself with, I think, *6, and let us know what you currently do.
And if this is Lori, if this is a person whom you've never seen this kind of challenging behavior from them before, so you have no way of knowing that they're going to all of a sudden pull a knife on the provider or they're going to start a fire, then we would expect, what I know that we have done in these situations in the past, is that you would have to impose, in the immediate right then, you would do an emergency control procedure where you basically would have to do a restraint. If the person's going to start a fire right there, you could be restraining them from starting the fire, and then you would be removing that fire-starting material from them by way of an emergency rights suspension. And we have all kinds of prescriptive rules around how to do that. So that's how I know that it's been done now, speaking for providers, if that provider isn't on the line.
Hi, this is Joe. Oh, go, Laurel. You got it. So this was if the person then removes consent. So if we've received consent to limit access to sharps, but then I believe somewhere in the FAQ, I'm not sure where, it says that the person can choose to remove consent at any time without really any due process. So they can say, I remove my consent that you can restrict my access to sharps. And then that person no longer has that restriction. They can access, I suppose at that point we unlock all the sharps. That's obviously a very dangerous situation if we have to give 2 weeks notice and we cannot limit access to those sharps. Even if you're saying, you can, in the moment, take the sharp away, that's still a very risky situation for a provider and the person.
Right, but right now, haven't you typically handled those by way of a rights suspension right now? And if the person, you don't have informed consent right now with that rights suspension, you have notice. So how have you handled that in that situation where you have a rights suspension and they go, well, forget it, I don't care about that rights suspension. I'm gonna go ahead and find a knife somewhere Then you deal with that in an emergency situation, and you might then decide to terminate services to that person. And then, yeah, the problem becomes, how does the person get served in the interim during your 15-day period where you're serving them notice to terminate services to them? That becomes another issue that is exactly the bottom line.
This is Jody, and I think also part of the question is there are currently, through right suspensions, many processes in place that are proactive, like somebody might have a bag search protocol coming back and forth from, say, a work site where they have more access to things or something like that, that enables us to ensure that there aren't fire-setting materials for individuals who have a recent history of attempting to start a fire or a recent attempt at attempting to utilize a sharp as a weapon. And those are the instances specifically that I think that we're looking for a little bit more guidance around, as because how are we then asking in true health and safety situations that if you are no longer doing things proactively and then all you can do is during an emergency control procedure while that individual has a knife or is attempting to start a fire, intervene. I really am concerned about the health and safety potential risk for a handful of individuals that are served, and I don't find giving notice to be an appropriate response. Then somebody else is...
So Jody, I'm confused because, so the example that you gave, absolutely right on as far as that, yes, there are proactive steps that you take, but in this case, you have this known dangerous behavior, right? So you would, in your rights modification that you're still able to do, you would have the bag searches still contained in that rights modification. You still have that proactive approach that you would use.
Not consent to those bag searches anymore.
What's that?
Right. It says in the FAQ that that person can remove consent at any time.
Yes, but they could do, for all intents and purposes, they could do that exact same thing with a right suspension. You don't get informed consent for a right suspension. You just give them notice that you're going to do these bag searches. But they at any time could say, you are not going to search my bag and pull out a sharp. And so, you follow the same approach in terms of having that proactive approach in the rights modification where you include in it that you're still going to do a bag search. And yes, they might not ever sign that informed consent to do that. And if they don't sign that informed consent to do the bag search, then you might choose not to continue to serve them.
What about the example of locking up sharps, right? So the person gives, right now, we would just give notice that we were going to lock up sharps. But in this, in the future, we would get informed consent that we are locking up sharps. And then that person says one day, you know what, I no longer want to give informed consent to lock up these sharps. I should have the right to access these sharps that I have. Can you unlock them? I'm removing that informed consent. What about that example?
I think the answer is, I think maybe to summarize what Lori was saying and what we're trying to say, if you know there's an issue, so I think you all get this, but just for the record, if you know there's going to be an issue with this person and some kind of object, you want to ideally build that up in advance and get their consent and build it into a rights modification with all the right documentation. If they have agreed to it at some point and then they revoke consent and say, I don't agree to this anymore, so in that case, they aren't consenting, they've revoked it. You don't have permission under the final settings rules to do what you were doing, but you may still have permission under emergency control procedures and emergency rights suspensions to do what you need to do to keep that person and yourself and others in the community safe. That's a different source of authority to keep doing the thing you were doing if you really think that there's a safety issue.
And honestly, clearly we have to flush this out. As Leah had said earlier, we need to provide more detailed guidance around this because this is evolving. Just like you guys asked if we would be creating a form for y'all to use as an informed consent, we have the pieces that you likely would need to include in your informed consent, just like we have all the things that CMS says that one has to do with a rights modification. We still need to flesh out how that's going to work, and particularly in these emergent situations. But yes, for the time being, you would employ our existing rules around emergency control procedures and emergency rights suspensions. But you still would have had to follow that, getting the upfront informed consent for that, to follow that set of processes, if that makes sense.
So I think, okay, so I think we'll have to add more to our answer here when we publish something. Okay. In the current environment, finding providers to respond to RFPs is very difficult. What happens if we were to provide notice to an individual who's retracted his or her informed consent and no other provider will serve the individual? We again have a question for this provider, which is how are you currently handling that kind of situation where no other provider is willing to step in if they're on their phone? Okay, they're not. They're. If you said something, you're still on mute. But we're not. There's no change in the policy for that. That's the answer.
Yeah.
I think this question is going back to the fact that if you can no longer keep the individual safe because they have revoked their consent, but you still have an obligation to serve them. I mean, there are instances, I think, in the community where all of us are serving an individual that isn't getting picked up for longer than our typical notice would require. And in those instances where we have lost the ability to provide the consent, I definitely hear what you're saying with the emergency control procedure, but a lot of the current suspensions that individuals have in place, if they are revoked, there's still a level of imminent health and safety issues, concerns that could come up where you just cannot guarantee the safety of an individual and services. I think that's the fundamental differences. Right now we can do it because we have the ability to provide suspensions, but if we have, say, somebody who has been deemed that they are incompetent to stand trial, so they don't have court orders in place specifically, but they still have a criminal recent past, and we can't put in place those proactive matters because the individual simply will not consent. How do we keep that individual and the community safe?
Yeah, so I guess that still goes back to that same issue of, again, that person with the right suspension that could be dangerous can at any point in time walk out of your services and say, I don't care that there's a right suspension in place, I'm going to go ahead and do this dangerous thing, and you're powerless to do anything about it then either. So, you serve notice, and then, yeah, unfortunately, the community and the person and the provider are at risk during that interim period of time till and unless another provider picks them up. And I mean, I think that's always been an existing problem. But yes, the element of informed consent versus just providing notice and imposing upon them does generate an additional challenge for us all. So we will work on fleshing out the details of that response more.
Yeah, I think that it's a really good question, and it's a difficult because this federal rule is changing something. But even the feds have acknowledged, if it's an emergent kind of situation, you're still going to look to the emergency control procedure or the emergency rights suspension if you have a imminent risk that people are going to be hurt or the individual will hurt themselves. Those are still in place.
I'm sorry, one last question, and then I promise I'll stop asking questions. I just heard you say emergency rights suspension. Is there any federal guidance around the potential lengths of an emergency rights suspension?
No, we wish. No. There's not. I think we'll have to do some thinking around, you know, if you want to do something for 2 weeks or something, is that the whole time an emergent situation? I think we have to think about that. So we're taking notes here, and we'll have to get back to you with more. Where were we? Okay. We're concerned, this question says, we are concerned about not being able to utilize a control procedure to ensure a person's safety, and we're even more concerned with the FAQ discussing the use of self-defense if warranted. The state has historically prohibited teaching in the use of self-defense techniques when supporting a person's need for safety. How will this change help keep people safe? We think it is an invitation for harm to people and services. Our answer here, as we said in our written response to item number 14, restraints and restrictive interventions can be used under certain conditions. If you think you may have to use them with someone, you need to do advanced planning and get the individual's consent and document it in their person-centered plan. And these requirements are new compared to the current IDD regs for safety and emergency control procedures, as well as the regs for many other waivers. What do you do if you don't have consent? Our response to item 32 says that when the provider no longer has consent, it may be able to take actions justified as self-defense or defense of others. In this context, when we're talking about self-defense, we're talking about that as a reason for an intervention. In other words, what is giving you a legal right to intervene here and do something to someone? We aren't talking about any particular method or technique for intervention, like how you intervene, what physical movement you're going to make. And so the bottom line is if a particular method is not allowable under the current rules, it's not allowable under the FAQ, and if it is already allowable, then under the FAQ, it's still allowable as long as you have a justification like self-defense or defense of others. Lori wanted to clarify a point here about and so what is and isn't allowable.
Yeah, and I think what may have thrown off in our response to this, the term self-defense, because, and again, I'm just speaking for the IDD system, we don't use that term, or we frown on that term self-defense. And if you're thinking about crisis intervention kinds of techniques like CPI or CATE or the MANT method, that really, the focus on those obviously are about teaching behavior as communication and de-escalation and using an escort or a physical restraint, ever putting your hands on another individual as the absolute last resort. And that absolutely is still the case. That is the expectations. That's how our rules are written. We have very, very prescriptive rules around the use of physical restraint. So what we're really talking about here is that we're not telling you what, if you should use MANT or you can or can't use MANT, or you can or can't use CATE or anything like that. You know, and we're also saying that if you know, again, our safety control procedure and emergency control procedures rules are still in force. And if the person is in imminent danger, they're going to run out into traffic. You've got to do something to keep them safe. Now, that's not a self-defense. That's a protection of that individual. And we would expect that you are going to physically stop them from running out into traffic. So that has not changed. And so we don't forbid, our rules currently do not forbid restraints, nor do the settings rules do not forbid restraint. Rather, that you have to use the rules as they are prescribed, and you have to protect people, and you can only use restraint in order to protect the individual and others' health and safety, and to de-escalate the situation in the least restrictive way, basically. So I don't know if that helps clarify.
Okay.
Lori, it's Leslie. How are you?
Hey, Leslie, good. How are you?
Good. I think if I can ask a clarifying question on this one, because I think this is what's getting us all kind of twisted and uncertain. We understand the rules in place to keep the person safe. We understand that we have to stop them from running out into traffic. But what we're reading in your responses to the FAQs is that if we're going to implement a safety control procedure, not an emergency control procedure, but safety, that we have to get an informed consent to go along with that. And I think that's where everyone's kind of struggling, like when a person's safety is in imminent harm and we don't typically ask permission to keep them safe, how are we supposed to get that informed consent? And I guess the second part of that is when you talk about the emergency control procedure, well, we know in rule it says if then there's an anticipated need for a restraint following that, we have to develop the safety control procedure. So that's kind of where a lot of these questions are coming from.
And I guess I would say that I think that it is okay. I think it would be good practice to say to the individual, it kind of goes same with the right suspension, that say we know that you have this propensity toward this dangerous behavior of running out into traffic, or we know that you have a tendency to strike out at your peers, that you live with or that you work with, and that you have a known history of hurting people when doing that. And we have a responsibility to keep your peers safe. So therefore, we're asking for your informed consent to, in the event of that, because we have this outlined, very prescribed way that we're going to do this safety control procedure with you, and we're going to use this specific intervention technique. I think it is absolutely appropriate to ask for their informed consent to do that. And we have to ask for we have to get an informed consent for the use of behavioral ISSP with a restrictive procedure, and a safety control procedure is the ultimate in restrictive procedure. So why would it not be appropriate to get an informed consent for that? And if that person or their guardian, the person who would be signing for them in the event that they can't, does not consent to that, I as the provider would be going, I'm not sure that I would be well equipped to serve this individual who is dangerous, who could hurt the people that he or she lives with, if I'm not able in the absolute last resort to use this safety control procedure. Does that make sense, Leslie?
Yeah, I think it does, but I think it kind of goes contrary to the stop the person from running out in the street if they're going to get hit by a car.
Well, that would be an emergency control procedure if it's not a known behavior.
But that's what I'm saying. If it then becomes a known behavior, then I have to have safety control. So I think there are just some follow-up questions that need to go along with this in terms of how much. Yeah, I think there are some follow-up questions that need to be asked.
Agreed, Leslie. Yeah, we definitely are taking notes feverishly here. So I think we're probably going to have to hit this one. We know we're going to have to hit this one really hard with a lot of more detailed responses. So we'll be working on that in the very near future.
Okay, great. Thank you, Lori.
You bet.
Okay, there was another question, and we are, by the way, we are trying to wrap up by 12:30, so we will work, but we are in fact near the end of the questions too. There is a large training component to this work for both the providers and the case management agency. Will there be a baseline standard training put out by the department or CDPHE? The answer is HCBS has already presented 7 trainings on the settings rule, and we want to ask you to visit our website on the final rule where you can see those trainings, see the slide decks and all the materials that went with them. Please do take a look. The next question, it relates to different timelines for providers and case management agencies to come into compliance. And I think the gist of this question we probably answered when we talked about the extension for case management agencies and providers to get all the rights modifications either kind of cleaned up and get consent to whatever you didn't already have consent for, or to eliminate the modification by May 31st, 2019. If I said the date right. Now I'm paranoid. Yeah, 2019. Okay. And then there's another question about CCBs and providers have meetings and may want additional information from HCPUF or CDPHE. And so we do use a lot of channels of communication to try to reach all of you. Some of us on this team have been on the CCB calls. We've been on the SEP calls. There's a quarterly PASA or IDD provider call. So there's a lot of ways that we try to send out information. And I think the best way, if you're a provider or a case management agency, you have some question about, am I doing this right? And you have not already had a site visit from CDPHE, you can request a voluntary site visit, and they will be happy to schedule one with you and provide on-site guidance and review your documents with you and really help you understand what you need to do in your personal case. So we hope that is helpful to you and that you all take CDPHE up on their offer. That is the last question that was submitted before the call. Are there any final questions while we still have a little time right now?
Yeah, I have a question. This is Tiffany with Developmental Pathways. As we're talking about the rights restrictions and suspensions, you haven't talked at all about what a case management agency is supposed to do when all providers have then refused to serve a person who won't sign an informed consent, and what the possible ramifications are for that individual and for the community. It feels like we're looking at putting people in regional centers or waiting until they commit a crime and then intervening and having court orders. We're just kind of at a loss over here as a case management agency. When a provider terms, we look for new providers. But if there are no providers who are willing to serve someone who refuses to sign an informed consent, that's a big problem. And I don't want to belabor the point. So if you want to say, hey, we need to think about this and talk about it, that's totally fine. I just want to call out that case management agencies take our responsibilities for serving people and finding services for them really seriously, and it feels like there might not be options for people who really do have some serious dangerous behaviors.
Right, duly noted. And this seems to be like the crux of the issue here relative to that change of informed consent over rights suspension. And I would love to chat with a few of you guys offline, namely the three of you who have I put down Jody, Laurel, Leslie, and Tiffany's name. And I'd love to maybe set up a conference call with y'all.
I would love that.
Okay.
Thank you. Sure.
Okay, so if you guys would be willing to send me your emails, and you know my email address, lori.thompson@state.co.us, then I'll set up a conference call just as soon as I'm able with you four, and I think we could just have a really focused conversation about this. Because I hear sort of the urgency around this just, affecting capacity and the health and safety of a particular vulnerable set of our population. So if you guys would do that, that would be great.
Thanks, Lori.
You bet.
Other questions?
Lori, this is Michelle with the SOMB.
Uh-huh.
Could I please be included on that conference call? I'll email you I'll email you.
Absolutely. That would be wonderful, Michelle. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other folks with questions? Star 6.
So, hi, my name is Minda Ide. I work at Access and Ability. I also, till the end of February, was a guardian for my uncle, who moved from a mental health institution where he'd been for many years on the CCT-EBD program. So I have a question. He actually lived in an apartment, had CDOS, those kind of supports. Our organization does children's case management, and we're looking at branching out into doing some work with the CCT program. So my question is, when they're not in a host home, they're in their own apartment, they have a guardian, they get CDOS because they aren't able to make good decisions. So would those restrictions still need to be, if they had restrictions, would that still need to be done, I forgot what you call them, the rights, the limiting of the rights, would that still need to be done with the case manager in that situation?
Yeah. So I want to make sure we understood the question. There's an individual who is receiving CDOS in their home or in a relative's home. Okay.
Right, in their own home.
Okay.
But they came from, they have, like, if you will, a court order. They were court ordered in the state mental health services, and when they moved from the institutional setting into the community, there were restrictions that came with them that were set up by the mental health system.
Yeah. Okay.
So in that situation, would that have needed, I mean, he passed away at the end of February, but we always, that was in his risk mitigation plan through CCT and all those other things, but I don't know if we ever really did those formal types of things. So in that situation where they have a guardian, they have a contract, if you will, the guardian signed on their behalf for them to live in the community, and there were some mostly environmental types of restrictions. You know what I mean? We mostly set up his home so that there wasn't conflict. Like, he lived there alone, so we didn't have to worry about foods he couldn't eat or that weren't prepared his way. But he did have, like, alcohol restrictions. Moving forward, if we worked with someone like that, would those rights restrictions need to be done based on that, the requirements of the mental health system?
Yeah, so if we're talking about a person who is receiving CDOS in their own home, the answer is twofold. Yes, the settings rule applies everywhere. I mean, CMS has a very broad rule. It applies wherever home and community-based services are rendered and wherever people receiving HCBS live. So yes. Right. And if there's restrictions, whether they're court-ordered or agreed to through some other means, they should be in the individual's person-centered plan. The second part of my answer is that as an enforcement approach that we are taking as a state, and CMS has encouraged states to take this somewhat, you could call it a shortcut, we are presuming that people in their own home that setting is compliant with the settings rule. So we aren't doing like CDOT site visits the way that ACS and group homes and what have you have been selected for site visits and are doing provider transition plans. So you should do it, and when we'll get around to checking that you have done it is, I think, in the course of the normal cycle of occasional site visits and desk reviews and whatever else other groups at HCPF have ever visited you for, or CDPHE.
And the reason I'm asking now is, like I said, our organization is looking at working with you guys for the Colorado Choice transitions, depending on what happens in the legislature with CMS, to do that kind of intensive case management and transition services. So I was just curious, because I don't know if we'll ever get another intensive client the way my uncle's was fairly intensive. There was a lot of, there were rules that were put on him just from the nature of being court-ordered to the Mental Health Institute. So in those situations, because in that scenario, it's like we did have case management. We got transition services. He lived in an apartment. He had CDS, but he had me, a legal guardian, and I pretty much coordinated, the environmental controls, everything else. I mean, he was aware. I mean, he had a camera in his living room, camera in his kitchen, but he was aware. Do you know what I mean? It's like he was aware that they were there. But we had those restrictions. I was just wondering, everybody would need to do a rights restriction plan, no matter what program they're on, I guess my question.
You would need to do a rights modification, yes, per the settings rule.
Yep.
Okay.
So
That's it.
We are out of time here. Again, thank you so much to everyone who submitted questions in advance or asked questions today. Very, very helpful, I think, for us and for all of you. That's all we had for today. We'll try to start putting more of this online as we get the recording and the transcripts for those who missed it. So thanks so much for joining us. You can all disconnect.